Hello, friends. Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history, where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times for peace negotiations, challenging the Trump administration, Ukraine, Russia, Europe, really the entire world. As always, I hope to bring you more light than heat as we dig a little deeper, each episode with guests from across the public policy spectrum. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Chelsea Patterson Sobolik, who works here in Washington, D.C. as the Director of Government Relations at World Relief. Previously, she's worked at the leading evangelical child welfare organization in the country, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, on Capitol Hill, and she's also been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and many other outlets. Chelsea was adopted as a newborn from Bucharest, Romania, and grew up in North Carolina. She holds a BA in International Relations from Liberty University. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you, Gary. It's so good to be here.
Yes, I'm excited to have this conversation. And really, I want to get into the very important letter that you and your organization have led in sending to President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio. But before we get to that, let's hear a little bit about your story. How did you end up getting involved in the fight for Ukrainian freedom?
Yeah, there's kind of three ways I'll answer this, and I'll try to be brief. The first answer is my own personal story. Like you mentioned, I was born in Romania. I'm ethnically Romanian, was adopted as an infant. I have four siblings who were adopted from Russia when Russia was open to outside adoption. And I have a cousin adopted from Ukraine. So that part of the world is very near and dear to our family story, my own personal story. I care very much about vulnerable children. The second way I'll answer that is when I worked in Congress. My boss at the time led Congress's largest bipartisan bicameral caucus, which is the Adoption Caucus. And there I really got to help cut my teeth on international child welfare public policy. We led a delegation abroad on some child welfare policies, and then worked on domestic child welfare policies too. So really got to dive deep onto legislation with vulnerable children. And then kind of the third way I'll answer that is before my role at World Relief, I worked for an organization called Lifeline Children's Services. They're the largest evangelical adoption agency, and they had done a number of adoptions from Ukraine for years and years. So there is where kind of at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that's where I was working at the time, and got wind of this issue of Russia abducting and stealing Ukraine's children, and really started working on it there, and have continued that work at World Relief. You know, we are a humanitarian organization. We serve in Ukraine, but we also care about family separation and about vulnerable people. And so really gotten to touch this issue both in my personal capacity, but then professionally for a number of years.
Wow, that is powerful. It's very personal.
Yes.
A lot of those adoptions from different countries. What is the status of that now? I assume since the full-scale invasion, no adoptions have been happening with Russia, Ukraine, that part of the world, or did it stop even before that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Russia shut down mid to late 2000s for a number of different reasons, which we can get into if you would like. So Russia's been shut down to Americans for a number of years. Up until the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was open. They would do a number of different kind of hosting programs in the U.S. and then international adoptions as well. I'll say for your listeners, I think it's important to note when I was adopted from Romania almost 35 years ago, international adoption looked very different than it does today. I was, 3 weeks old when I was adopted. Nowadays, we actually just got numbers from kind of the global data. International adoption was at an all-time low. There's a number of different reasons for that. A lot of countries are open to domestic adoption, which is wonderful. But there's a shift to children eligible for international adoption, or older children or sibling sets. Kind of the harder to place children. And so that's a lot of the children we are seeing adoptable from Ukraine as well. Since Russia's invasion, adoption has basically been paused, and there's a number of some of those reasons are good. International laws protect children during times of conflict, which we'll get into. And so during times of conflict, it is harder to kind of do some of those due diligence to make sure a child is an orphan, to make sure a child is not being trafficked during times of war. So I know there's been a few cases that have been able to be processed, but it's basically been paused right now.
As we unpeel the layers of this onion, and before we get to the letter, it makes sense to me that the world is, in industrialized world, is facing kind of a birth dearth, decreasing and shrinking populations. I think that Vladimir Putin saw this within his own country, high abortion rates, low birth rates, and the backdrop is he needs more citizens. He needs more babies. He needs more children. Is that an accurate portrayal?
That too, and I would say too, I think, I'll give the example of Romania during communism. They actually had laws in place that if a woman didn't have a child by a certain age, her family would be taxed. And so all these children who were born, and it was communist Romania, they didn't have the resources to take care of them. So a lot of them were institutionalized. I think globally, even in the US, we're seeing a pretty steep birth decline. Russia's way of handling that is partially by stealing children from Ukraine. I think there is a more nefarious thing happening too, where it's Russia kind of exerting itself and its power and dominance over Ukraine, and Ukraine's most vulnerable members, their children. Publicly they've been, we're taking care of these children. They were orphans and we are taking care of them. But we know that that's not true. And we know that there are international laws that guide how children are to be protected during times of conflict.
Right. I remember going back for my own story to 1994. My first ever missions trip I did as a high schooler was to an orphanage in Romania.
Wow, no way.
Believe it or not. So it was an experience of helping build spaces and working with carpenters and working to build restroom facilities, and really saw the remnants of that communist system. But I also saw the children up close, and it became real. And when I think about looking in the eyes of those children, I think now about the Ukrainian children and those that have been taken. So unpack for us now the push for this letter and what this coalition that you're bringing together through World Relief is trying to do for those children.
Yeah, thank you. Such a good question. Let me back up and kind of share what's happened with the children. So since the full-scale invasion in 2022, hard to believe it's been that long.
3 years.
Russia has stolen almost 20,000 children from Ukraine. At first, they were being sent to what they would be called summer camps. But then it started to come out that those children weren't able to call home. They weren't able to go home. They weren't able to be reunified with their families. And then it started to come out that these children were being subjected to military training camps, which I know we'll get into more, political re-education camps. So at these summer camps, they were being indoctrinated with a lot of Russian propaganda. And then kind of some of the more severe things we saw, they were being subjected to forced foster homes and forced adoption, which is incredibly illegal. They also were, we have stats of them being physically abused, not being given enough nutrition, things like that. So that's happened kind of in the backdrop of all of the other atrocities that we've seen being committed against Ukrainians. Russia to date has only returned about a very small handful, I believe about 2,000, no less than 1,256 children have been returned. And I think it's important to note one of the other things that was happening and is continuing to happen is men of military age are compelled in Ukraine, correct me if I'm wrong, but are compelled to serve with the military. And that leaves women and mothers trying to take care of the home, trying to take care of their children. And so, I mean, we see time and time again, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether around the world and throughout human history, that in times of war and conflict, the most vulnerable of society, women and children, always pay the highest price. And so I would say these mothers are doing the best they can, but they're home, either trying to find where their children went or just doing the best they can. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is that Russia actually has intentionally targeted the weakest of the children, those who actually were true orphans, those who didn't have parents looking out for their family, looking out for their best interests, and children with disabilities. So it's an incredibly nefarious thing that Russia has perpetrated against the people of Ukraine and the children of Ukraine.
So this letter that you have sent really highlights some of that, and you're trying to speak up for those children that have been emptied out of orphanages, taken back to Russian re-education camps to have their religious identity and cultural identities erased. And so you've sent the letter to the President and Secretary of State Rubio.
Yes. So last week, or let's see the date, the 1st of April, or the first week of April, when your listeners are listening to this, we sent a faith leader letter, which you graciously signed. We're grateful. But a number of other prominent Christian advocates and evangelical voices. So the National Association of Evangelicals, Family Research Council, the Southern Baptists, a bunch of and you can go to our website to read the full list of signatures.
I've got it here.
Yeah, so the letter simply says that in any peace talks, peace negotiations, the return of Ukraine's children must be a precondition to peace agreements. And we can get into why that specific language is very, very important. But the letter does praise President Trump in a recent call with Ukrainian President Zelensky for raising this issue, for making sure that he dialogued with Ukraine's president about this. So we do ask that these vulnerable children are returned home as a pre-negotiation, and then also thank him for raising this. I know there's a number of ongoing conversations happening with our administration, with Putin and Zelensky, and so we continue to ask for and urge that the littlest members of society are prioritized in these peace talks.
Yeah, it was encouraging that it has been getting attention. There is, though, an area of controversy related to the Doge cuts that have happened. There was some question about this Yale database that was being used to track children or gather data, and that maybe that data had been lost in the process of Doge doing widespread cuts. Can you tell us what's the status of that data at this point?
So real quick background. So the Yale, there's a arm of Yale's Humanitarian Center that's funded by the State Department. And they were kind of the neutral third party who housed this database. Initially, it was reported that Doge had cut that program, which I believe is accurate. And then actually Congress sent a bipartisan, bicameral letter to the administration saying that they had heard that potentially the database had been deleted, which would be very, very disastrous.
Yeah, catastrophic.
Catastrophic, exactly. So, Judiciary Chair Grassley raised this in a letter. The termination was rescinded, and the database holds. It's a temporary reinstatement of this Yale program so that they can transfer the data to Europol to continue on that work. So I'm very grateful that it looks like the database has been preserved, that Congress did on a bipartisan basis raise this issue with the administration.
That is so important. When I was in Kyiv in December, I was able to visit one of the new orphanages where the Bring Back Kids campaign was able to save and rescue rescue some of the orphans and children that were taken. So I got to meet those children and spend some time with them, and I knew that database had been part of the effort
return,
in informing and working with officials. So that's very heartening to hear.
I'm grateful. Yeah.
One of the things that's not so heartening is the news that was breaking today, and that's the Bring Back Kids. Posted on the X, Russia is turning a former children's camp in occupied Mariupol into a military training center for kids on the shores of the Azov Sea, where Ukrainian children once spent summers. So this camp is now in Mariupol, which is in the occupied territory, is going to be used to train future Russian warriors, taking Ukrainian children and re-indoctrinating them. Tell us your reaction. Is this something that surprises you in any way?
It doesn't. Again, we've seen kind of the beginnings of this, and I was telling you before we hit record, I actually have some images we can share publicly. The children's faces are blurred out, obviously, but of these Ukrainian children at military training camps, and in one of the images, there's this. He looks like a mascot, which is for children, but then you see. The camouflage bus, and the children are wearing camouflage. I have images of children that look to be as young as 10 to 12 holding machine guns. And so we've started to hear this, and I'm grateful that this is, hopefully going to garner more media attention. The world collectively, during kind of the Lost Boys of Sudan, or seeing, our worst adversaries around the world.
Yeah, a lot of images of Hamas doing these kinds of military training of children.
Exactly. And we're rightly outraged. We should be. These are children who don't have, they're not of military age. So in some ways it doesn't surprise me. I think what I will say is we've seen since the invasion that this is not just President Putin's priority. This is being executed on every level, a state, a region, it's a whole of government, if you will, approach on Russia's side. And so I think the world needs to wake up to what's happening to Ukraine's children. And I will say this again and again, it's against international law. There are laws. The Geneva Convention protects children during times of conflict. And if I may, one of the reasons that we used the language in the letter, and we'll continue advocating with the administration that children are returned as a pre-negotiation, is because children are not hostages. Children should not be a bargaining chip in peace talks or in negotiations. Children should be returned home before kind of those peace talks are ever continued further. And so that's one of the reasons that we use that language. So I hope that this continues to stir the consciences of people just a couple blocks away on Capitol Hill and within the American people. We're people of faith. We know the church. And so I hope that this continues to move their hearts.
Well, Chelsea Sobolik, we do appreciate your leadership in pushing the envelope and making this case on Capitol Hill to the State Department. This is so important. We don't forget those children. Let's pivot now and talk about the current negotiations. And, I want you to say as much as you can in your role, but it feels like we are at maybe a breaking point in terms of the relationship President Trump has with Vladimir Putin. President Trump says that he is very disappointed. He's maybe used stronger language, that negotiations haven't yielded more fruit. So are we at a breaking point? Do we think it's put up or shut up time for Vladimir Putin in terms of negotiations and making progress?
It's a great question, and I will let people much, much smarter than me kind of answer that question. What I will say is, if we are at that breaking point, I hope and urge the administration to continue prioritizing kind of human rights and vulnerable children. That if we are at an inflection point, that children aren't pushed to the side to get a deal or whatnot. That as Christians and as policymakers should care about family separation. And, one of the things I've said often throughout my work with vulnerable populations, but children especially, is we can often talk about, being a voice for the voiceless. And that's not true. These children have a voice. Their voice just isn't being heard with the administration and on Capitol Hill. And so we get to kind of highlight their voices and their stories. And so whatever happens in the next couple days and weeks and months, I will continue World Relief. Hopefully, this coalition we're kind of helping to build will continue to prioritize vulnerable children.
The coalition letters focused more on the executive department, branch. President Trump, Secretary of State Rubio. You've spent a lot of time, though, on Capitol Hill. Do you think the attitude of Capitol Hill right now is actually one where, hey, that used to be our issue. We're going to hand that off. The Ukraine issues now handed off to the executive branch. We're happy that we don't have to kind of play lead and we can just be quiet about it and kind of forget it. Is that maybe the attitude on Capitol Hill right now and something you have to work to change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say I was encouraged that both the House and Senate letter about the DOJ termination was bipartisan, that it wasn't just partisan. Don Bacon, Chuck Grassley, Tom Tillis, I was grateful that it was bipartisan. And, whether those conversations are revived, I don't know, and I can't speak to that. But I am seeing Congress kind of on a bipartisan basis say, like, we actually do care about these kids, or we do care about this issue, and we want to make sure that this is part of those conversations moving forward. So I was heartened by that, especially, if there's one thing that Chuck Grassley cares about, it is vulnerable children. I've worked with his office 12 years at this point, and that man cares about vulnerable children. And so I was encouraged to see him use his judiciary chairmanship to engage there.
Very good. Let's dig on maybe a topic that you can comment on more specifically. USCIRF's 2025 report, and it highlighted countries of concern, and Russia was on that list. Ukraine was not. Russia remains on that list for many reasons. Is that an area where World Relief is paying attention and advocating for religious freedom?
Yes, absolutely. So last year we actually released a report, and we looked at this issue of religious persecution and kind of the intersection of protections the U.S. can offer those fleeing violence. And so refugee resettlement is one. Humanitarian parole is one. And we've actually seen this issue with Ukraine get caught up a little bit in the past couple of days. But I think two things need to happen kind of in tandem with the issue of religious persecution. Number one, conditions on the ground need to improve. And if I may, number two, I think the U.S., when we're at our best, offers humanitarian protections to those who cannot safely return home. And we've offered protections for Ukrainians, and I hope we will continue to offer that protection, especially for women and children.
Yep. I always ask our guests if there's one thing on this topic that we didn't yet uncover and you would just kick yourself if we didn't maybe discuss as we get towards the end of today's episode, what might that be?
Love that question. I think I'd say two things. The members of Congress who work on behalf of vulnerable children, whether domestic or international, these are not their constituents. They are not the ones who are voting for them, domestically not yet, but especially internationally, these are not their constituents. They really do it because it's the right thing to do. And so I always want to applaud efforts I see on Capitol Hill for members engaging on this issue. You and I both know members of Congress face 4 dozen things that they can focus on every day. And so when members choose to prioritize the littlest members of society, I'm always grateful. And then I think the second thing I would, want to tie a bow on is, I've said this again and again, but in times of conflict, we should always remember that the most vulnerable also pay a very heavy price, whether it's with their lives, whether it's with their rights being trampled on, their religious freedom being snuffed out. We see it time and time again all over the world. And so I want to remind lawmakers and this and any administration to prioritize the vulnerable in times of conflict.
Chelsea Sobolik, we appreciate you sharing your heart today and a little bit different area of your heart off the topic of Ukrainian freedom and peace and power there. Could you just share with us a little bit about your book? I know you're an author, and I wanted to make sure that our listeners could also go check out another part of what your heart is concerned about.
Thank you. I'd be happy. So my first book is entitled Longing for Motherhood, Holding On to Hope in the Midst of Childlessness. And my very personal hat on, I found out when I was a teenager that I was born with a somewhat rare medical condition that prevents me from having biological children. So we actually welcomed our son home through international adoption a year and a half ago, which is crazy. He's from India. And it's so neat how the Lord just kind of weaves everything through our lives. I'm one of 6 children adopted. And so I already had a very special place in my heart for that, even before I knew that would be the way we built our family. And then my second book is on Christian women in the workplace, which is another topic I care very, very much about. So those are my 2 books, and they're available Amazon and wherever books are sold.
Great. Well, we encourage all of our listeners to check those out. Chelsea Sobolik, we loved having you on the Peace and Power Ukraine pod today, and we'll see all of you next time.